dog's life. But clearly those humans have never spent time in my neighborhood. That's the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, Louisiana. I wish I could tell you my name. The reality is, most times I'm just referred to as that damn dog. So I'm going to call myself by what I've always thought of myself, ADT, because in reality, that's what I am. I'm a security system. I live my life entirely at the end of a leash and a chain. My purpose is to protect my owner's goods. You see, people down here in the lower Ninth Ward don't have much. What they have, they're very fierce to protect. And they do that in two ways, guns and dogs. Every day, my life was rather similar. My whole function in life was to sit, bark at whatever moved as it crossed my path. And that's what I did, day after monotonous day. The reality was, however, life changed. And it changed dramatically for me on the morning of August 27th, 2005. The neighborhood was suddenly alive in a way that I'd never seen it before. Bartholomew Street, where I lived on, was abuzz. Action everywhere. People were packing cars. Everywhere there was people rushing about. People loading up all their personal belongings, food, water, blankets, all into the backs of cars. My owners were no different. They were also caught up in this whirlwind of activity. The constant banging of nails and hammers as plywood was applied to windows to protect from the upcoming storm gave me a headache. I watched as my family's car was loaded up, and I wondered, will I be going? Will they be taking me? All of a sudden, they emerged with all their belongings and put it in the trunk. I was excited. Oh my God, my first car ride. How could this be? I'd never been in the car before. Slowly, I could hear from a neighbor's radio a gentle voice asking people to pack up all their belongings and leave New Orleans. Apparently, it was a mandatory evacuation. The person in this very low, methodical voice said a Category 5 hurricane named Katrina was headed straight towards New Orleans. Meteorologists were predicting that it would have devastating consequences. Temporary shelters were being set up in Baton Rouge and other cities north of New Orleans. I waited and waited. The mayor of New Orleans' voice got more and more serious. He spoke deeply and said, "Citizens of New Orleans, please leave immediately. This is the one we've always been fearing all our lives." I had no idea what he was talking about. But then again, I'm just an animal. All I knew was that I never at once, throughout his long 5-minute message warning residents to evacuate, heard ever the word pet, animal, dog, cat. Why was the mayor of New Orleans asking for an evacuation of the city, and yet not providing any plans for the evacuation of the city's animal populations? Shelters established in Baton Rouge and other cities north of New Orleans for humans did not allow pets. The only opportunity for people to take pets with them was if they could find a relative willing to allow pets in their home. Moving to a motel was clearly not an option. The reality is, this is Louisiana. There's no hotels that take pets in Louisiana. The other option was, of course, leaving the pets behind. Suddenly I saw my owners move out the front door. I jumped and jumped, wagged my tail, excited about the possibility of my very first car ride. My excitement soon turned to anguish, however, when I was led inside the house. Actually, it wasn't all anguish, because the reality was I hadn't spent much time in my house. I could only remember being in my house a few times, and that always meant a bad thing. A thunderstorm was coming. They patted me on the head, told me not to worry, and said, "We'll be back in a couple of days. No worries, just be good. Try not to break anything." At first I was excited. I was alone in the house, free to roam from room to room, see all the sights that I'd missed while I was sitting there on those monotonous days outside, performing my function as the security system. However, I soon started to fear as I jumped around and I took refuge on the sofa. I thought about the severe beating I'd received if my parents ever knew that that's what I was doing in their absence. Then I saw the huge bowl of food that lay for me in the kitchen. I ran over to it immediately, devoured almost all of it until my stomach hurt from eating so much. Then I decided, what the hell? I gotta sleep on that sofa, damn those people. So I took my refuge on the forbidden sofa. Before I fell asleep, I started to wonder, why? Why was I left behind? Had I done something wrong? Had I misbehaved? I wondered, how is it that a human could just leave behind a devoted pet? They didn't leave their kids behind. Nobody was escaping without taking their children or elderly parents. Was I not part of the family too? And then I laughed and caught myself chuckling at my own stupidity. Of course not. I wasn't part of the family. I was just the ADT system. It was dark, and the rain and wind started. Slowly at first, but ever increasingly louder and louder. For hours, the wind shook the home. Rain started to pour through holes in the roof as shingles were blown off. And the noise, it sounded like the freight trains that used to run through my neighborhood. I was terrified, shaking. Eventually, I watched as shelving fell down. Pictures fell off the treasured tables, and dishes smashed onto the floor. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but it seemed to me that the world was coming to an end. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. By the next afternoon, the storm had subsided. I looked around. There was broken glass everywhere, books strewn all over the floor, plates smashed all over the kitchen table. But my only thought was, I've survived. Category 5 storm, and I'm still alive. Then my thoughts turned to the inevitable beating that I would receive. Because clearly when I got home, my owners got home, they'd blame me. They'd see the destruction, and how was I going to convince them it wasn't my fault? Eventually, I began to hear voices outside. Many of my neighbors had chosen not to remove themselves from New Orleans and had instead decided to stay through the storm. But they had nowhere to go, no cars to get there. And by the panic in their voices and the cries of the women and children, I could only imagine what my neighborhood must actually look like. I heard sirens everywhere. The storm, of course, had caused dozens of gas lines to explode. Also, people were trapped in the debris of their homes. I was actually relatively lucky. My home had withstood the quality of the storm. I waited, expecting any minute for my owners to come through that front door. And I tried to think about where I could hide so I could miss out on the inevitable beating I'd receive for all the mess and destruction in the household. Suddenly I heard what seemed like an enormous explosion off in the distance, and then a constant rumbling sound. The levees had broken. After half an hour, it sounded like shotgun blasts, a sound I was not all that unfamiliar with. And so I jumped to the sofa to see through a crack in the front window. There was water bursting from the water main pipes like geysers. Already several inches of water lay in the city streets surrounding my home. People were running in all directions, screaming, "The levees have broken! The levees have broken!" I had no idea what this meant, but I knew from their voices that this was somehow very, very serious. I was exhausted, so I fell asleep despite all the commotion. When I woke, I looked again out my front window, and to my complete astonishment, the water was now several feet deep. And to my utter dismay, I turned around to find several inches of water in my own home. It was leaking through the front door. Several hours passed, and I watched the water levels rise in my house. And then yet another thunderous explosion, and suddenly I was completely underwater, swimming for my life. I'd never swam before in my life, but somehow instinct told me to kick my feet around and keep my head above water. The power of millions of gallons of water smashing up against my plywood protection had buckled the plywood and allowed the water to pour through into my house, flooding my house ever deeper and deeper. The furniture smashed through walls, and parts of the ceiling caved in. I was terrified. I looked around. I knew it. I was going to die. Several times, I fell into that dark, stinking water as the water continued to rise, and I continued to try and kick and keep my exhausted legs from allowing my head to sink below that water level. Finally, the ceiling collapsed, and I could see a little light shining down through the rafters. I swam and made several attempts to pull myself up onto the roof beam. I finally did, and the roof beams became my salvation. There I was in the attic, stuck on a beam as I watched the water swirl below. Darkness fell, and all I could hear was the horrified screams of human beings and the barking of anxious dogs. And finally, the water stopped rising. As I watched through the night, the screams of human beings got louder and louder. The barks of dogs trapped in attics and on rooftops. The wallowing made me fearful and terrified. And yet days passed. Nothing. Nobody was coming to help us. 2 days later, after the levees broke, finally I heard the sound of what sounded to be like thunder. Later I would understand this was helicopters, rescuing people captured off their roofs tops. I found a tiny little hole in the roof where I could peer out, but not large enough to squeeze myself through. I could see people being lifted in metal baskets up into bright red helicopters. The water had finally stopped rising, and after 3 days of hell, I became optimistic. Surely one of those red helicopters would lower down a basket and bring me to safety. Eventually, as I watched the events, my optimism turned to horror. I watched my neighbors, one by one, lifted off their rooftops, but having to push down their precious dogs and cats, leaving them behind, stranded on rooftops. Many were shouting with the camouflaged uniformed men who were performing this human rescue service. They were soldiers, taught to obey orders, and the orders were, this is a human rescue effort only, no animals allowed. We were being left behind, left to die in the dark, stinking waters of New Orleans. I heard later from my daddy that a man by the name of Kanye West, whose music I'd often heard in my hood, had stated on a television program that George Bush didn't care for black people. I thought about it myself and thought, he could have added, George Bush doesn't care about animals either. I was starving. No food, no water. The only drink that I could ever come up with was lipping up a little bit of the water filled with gasoline, oil, rotten corpses, human and animal feces. It made me sick each time I lipped some up, but it was my only salvation, my only ability to survive. Days passed. Surely help was coming. But soon I started to realize there was no more thunder, there was no more helicopters, and those voices of the humans that I had heard trapped on their rooftops began to subside. The heat was unbearable. Most days it was 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit in my attic. Each day I felt closer to death, and after a week I almost preferred it would come. But still I remained, trapped on that single beam in my attic. Days and nights passed. I lost track of them, as a matter of fact. Every once in a while I heard human voices off in the distance, and the sound of small motorboat engines. I wondered, who are these people? What are they doing here? The rest of the world has forgotten us and left to die. Who are these people? Why have they decided not to abandon us? Finally, yes, September 20th, and I repeat, September 20th, more than 3 weeks after the levees broke, a strange light appeared in the darkness. I heard human voices approaching. It was a flashlight. I barked as loud as I could given my weak state, trying to attract attention to this particular house on Bartholomew Street. The voices got louder, and finally a stranger stuck his head through a hole that he had hammered in the plywood in the front doorway. He said, "Hello, boy, come here, come here." I was terrified. The last thing I wanted to do was jump down from my place of salvation, that single being that had supported me for more than 3 weeks. But what choice did I have, I said to myself. So I mustered all the bravery I could and jumped back into that dirty, stinking water and swam. And I swam and was pulled through my front window and into a waiting boat. A man and woman reassured me that I would be okay, and we were lifted into a boat and taken off to safety. There was about 6 of us in this boat, and we made it eventually to dry land. I couldn't understand if I would ever see dry land again. All those days amongst the beams and amongst the swirling waters, I'd spent most of the time thinking, will my feet ever touch dry land again? And finally I had my answer. Yes, I would. The 6 of us that had been loaded into the boat finally made it to high land and were put into the back of a waiting van in crates. I couldn't wait to get out of here. We barked, come on, let's go, let's get out of this hellhole. But we stayed, and we couldn't figure out why we stayed, until the man and woman started talking to each other. The woman said, "This is ridiculous. I can't believe we have to wait until nightfall, because otherwise the soldiers might arrest us for trespassing and breaking the barricades." The reality was animal rescue workers in New Orleans were subject to arrest for breaking through a military blockade which said no human beings were allowed in the city of New Orleans until further notice. The reality was, even if you were not arrested by the police, you could fulfill a fate far worse. Animal rescuers who entered New Orleans in the daytime or at night were often assumed to be looters, and therefore often found themselves the victims, or at least the targets, of shootings by the military police, whose job it was to protect the territorial integrity of New Orleans. Finally, as darkness fell, the van drove off, and we were taken 45 minutes north to a little town called Gonzales, Louisiana, which became our new home, the Lamar Dixon Expo Center. 7 barns, usually used for the exhibit of livestock and horses, became our temporary shelter. I heard when I came off the van, human beings saying, "These 6 dogs need to be processed." I had no idea what processing meant. Sounded like a strange word to me. But the next thing I knew, I had a rope around my neck and I was being led off, past hundreds of cages of dogs who looked a lot like me. Pit bulls, Rottweilers, many of my canine neighbors from the lower 9th Ward. I realized the first step of processing I didn't like too much. It involved a wet bath. After 3 weeks of being traumatized by water, you would have thought the first thing and the last thing I wanted was water. But somehow being clean again gave me a sense of self. Next, I was led down a corridor and I saw a white-gowned person. The white-gowned person looked at my teeth, checked my ears, stuck a thermometer where nobody has any business sticking a thermometer, and eventually called me to be okay. And I was sent off to my new home, Barn 5. Barn 5, I was put in a stall that had been used for horses at one time, so there was a little layer of hay. I was surrounded by 10 pit bulls who barked aggressively at me whenever I looked at them. They didn't seem to like me as their new neighbor. I had my first food and clean water in over 20 days, and finally a blanket to sleep on. I slept, and I actually slept for the first time in weeks. I awoke about 5 a.m. the next morning to the sound of my cage being opened. It was a man with a funny accent. He put in a leash around my neck and pulled me to come with him. I was a little scared and actually a little embarrassed. The reality was I'd never been on a walk before. I didn't know how to go for a walk. As soon as I stepped a few paces from my cage, I saw a woman who had a funny accent. She was busy cleaning out my cage, putting in a new blanket, filling my water dish, and putting a little bit of kibble in my bowl. The man with the funny accent led me around the parking lot and over to a grassy section where I could smell I was supposed to urinate. After about 10 minutes, I was led back to my cage. The woman smiled at me and saw that I had a clean cage to be housed in. The man reached down, wrapped his arms around me, and gave me a big hug. It was the first time I'd ever had a hug in my life. I didn't know who these people with the funny accents were, but somehow I thought, I kind of like these people. I watched them, and I watched the man and woman with the funny accents and watched them repeat the same process hour after hour, each time returning a dog to the cage and never forgetting to give it a big hug and a kiss on the cheek. I thought, oh no, maybe I'm not so special after all. By now, it was afternoon. Typical Louisiana, hot and humid. I could still see the couple with the funny accents continuing their routine. Wait a minute, hadn't I come in last night at 9:30 p.m.? And wasn't it now 4:30 in the afternoon the next day? Those two hadn't left. In the days to come, I would recognize that they worked 18 to 20 hours a day, and I rarely saw either of them take a break. And I never saw them eat anything more than a granola bar and a jug of Gatorade. Once a day, they disappeared for a few hours. And later I learned that was just to get a few hours sleep and to eat their one meal a day at the only restaurant open in Gonzales, the Waffle House. There were other volunteers, and most of them spoke with funny accents as well. I heard when they were talking that most of them were from the West, California, Oregon, Washington State. But the people that had come to be my favorites were the people with the funny accents, and I understood they were from a place called Canada. I didn't have any clue where Canada was, but the way the other volunteers spoke of it, I realized it must be really, really far away. A lot of the volunteers only came once, and they mostly came to take pictures. They particularly liked to play with puppies and the small, cute dogs. The Rottweilers and Pit Bull mixes, which were the majority of us, often got left alone. And many volunteers were afraid to walk them, and some wouldn't even open their cages to give them the fresh water and food that they so desperately needed. Here we were, in a rescue situation, and once again, abandoned. Our reputation had clearly preceded us. I came to enjoy my walks, especially when it was the nice man and woman from Canada. I was finally sleeping and eating, and even my appetite was coming back. I only weighed 38 pounds, and yet I was a year-and-a-half-old Rottweiler Pit Bull mix. I should have weighed 60 pounds. I was emaciated. You could see every single bone in my body. On the night of September 22nd, there was quite a commotion. The volunteers were talking about Hurricane Rita, which was due to make landfall and headed straight for New Orleans. What? Another hurricane? I thought, humans said lightning never struck twice. Those stupid humans. I heard a large 18-wheeler transport truck pull up, and I saw volunteers starting to load dogs in their crates into the back of the truck. They piled them 3 and 4 deep. The volunteers tried to get as many dogs out of Louisiana before the next hurricane hit as possible. I could see the man with the funny accent at the back of the truck. It was near midnight, and he was covered in sweat. He was lifting virtually every single crate into the back of the truck, and another man was placing the dogs further up into the air-conditioned unit. All I could have think about that night was, there's another hurricane coming. Damn it, put me on that truck. I want out of here. I don't want to live through another hurricane. The man and woman from Canada finally took a break. They were drinking water, walking up and down the aisle, and they paused in front of my cage. They stopped, looked, and I thought, finally, they're here. There's only a few spaces left on that truck. I'm going on that truck. Thank you, God. They both looked at me, smiled, and then left. Abandoned again. Little did I know, my future mommy and daddy had a much different thought of my life than working in a Florida prison with dangerous inmates as a therapy dog. Actually, in retrospect, thank God nobody put me on that truck. The next day, most of us dogs didn't get a whole lot of attention. The volunteers were busy putting cases of dog food provided by the companies to build a small wall to keep the stalls from flooding when the hurricane hit. All the rescue groups, including PETA, Animal Planet, and various companies such as Purina, lined up their 18-wheelers to act as a barricade against the inevitable winds that would damage the structure because it had no walls. About 4 p.m. on September 23rd, all the volunteers, all those humans, were in a great big circle outside the barns, about 250 of them in total. We dogs knew something was up. We had arranged, the main leader seemed to say through a microphone, "We have arranged shelter for you in local churches and schools. The governor has ordered your evacuation. We will leave only 4 people per barn, a total of 25 volunteers, to stay behind with more than 2,500 animals. The rest will be loaded onto buses and taken to security shelters. The governor has ordered anyone who does not evacuate from the projected path of the hurricane, please write down your social security number in permanent ink on your arm so that we can identify your body." My daddy said he wanted to laugh, he would tell me in later years, but at the same time, it was one of the only times he was truly afraid for his life. The mood among the volunteers was rather somber. Everyone went back to their respective barns to see whose name was on the list to stay. I hoped that those crazy Canadians would end up staying, but I couldn't see them. People began to line up for the buses, and still no sight of those crazy Canucks. One by one, we all watched as the humans left to find shelter and once again leave us stranded against the ravages of Mother Nature. It seemed like there was nobody left. All the people had disappeared. It was just us dogs again. All we could see was a group of about 20 people, all covered in rain suits and passing out hard hats and protective eye goggles for the case of flying debris from the inevitable storm that was on its way. 4 of those humans started to head towards our barn 5. As they draw nearer, I could make out Tim and Donna, who are representatives of a group called Mad Rap, a pit bull rescue organization based in the Bay Area of California. And then they appeared, those crazy Canucks, Murray and Dinah. Somehow, I constantly felt better. Just after midnight, an eerie silence grew over the barn. Us dogs, we didn't need no super duper Doppler radar to tell us what was coming. We'd heard that sound before. Sure enough, the wind began to pound the entire complex and rain came down in buckets. The crazy Canucks had pulled their station wagon into one of the stalls. The car rocked back and forth, and not in a good way, I might say, but stayed upright. This time, the levees consisting of dogs' food actually held. So much for the Army Corps of Engineers. By morning, the storm was over and the sun was shining. I felt I had survived. Oh my God, I made it through 2 hurricanes in the matter of a month. Many of the volunteers started to arrive back at the shelter, having spent the night in churches and schools. Yet again, there was a key meeting of the humans called. We dogs knew what it was about. In fact, anyone who had ever been through a hurricane knew what it was about. But those crazy Canucks, they were dumbfounded. They were clueless. The reality was the hurricane would be back, and it would be back in an hour from the opposite direction. We had 1 hour to take all the stuff that we had loaded, the artificial levees we had created with packs of dog food, and move them to the opposite side of the barn. The sky was bright and sunny. It was hot and humid as it always was in Louisiana. And I watched as the human beings ran from side to side, carrying those lugging those crates of dog food to protect us from the inevitable rain. It grew dark, the clouds picked up, and once again, Hurricane Rita battled us for a second time, though not as bad as the first time around. Again, our levees of dog food survived, and we were okay. I went to sleep that night, glad to be alive and anxious for those crazy Canucks to take up and wake me up for my morning walk. I waited and waited as I woke up, but there was no sign of them. I wish I could have asked the other human volunteers where they went. Had the hurricane scared them off? I would have understood that, but I would have thought that our relationship had dictated that they would have at least come to me and said goodbye. I sat and sat, but there was no sign of that red station wagon that I recognized as the Crazy Canucks vehicle. They had left me behind. How could they do that? I grew melancholy. I was almost beside myself by supper time. There was still no appearance from them, still no sight. When off in the distance I saw that familiar red station wagon, this time accompanied by a white minivan. Out jumped the Crazy Canucks, one from each vehicle. I got up and saw that they were headed straight in my direction. The man opened my cage and put a leash on me. Another walk! Awesome! I love walks now. But it wasn't another walk. This time we didn't head for the grassy knoll where I was used to peeing by now. This time we went to a lineup. We stayed in line, and I noticed that the woman with the funny accent had a black lab and a shepherd mix on leashes as well. The man passed my leash to the woman, and a few minutes later returned back, this time with a beagle. The Crazy Canucks signed a few papers, and then the person behind the desk said, "Canada? Boy, you boys are in for a long ride." What? I'm going to Canada? I had no idea where Canada was, but the only thing I'd learned so far was that Canada was a long way away. The couple looked down at us and looked at their papers. They turned to me and said, "We're going to call you Bart. You came from Bartholomew Street." They looked at the Rottweiler and Shepherd mix and said, "You're going to be BJ. You were found at the intersection of Bartholomew and Johnson." They looked at the beagle, Bernard, because he was found in St. Bernard Parish. And finally, Beau, after General Beauregard, who a Confederate general, the historian in me, had to name something after the historical legacy of New Orleans. So those Crazy Canucks loaded the four of us, two into a van and two into the station wagon. It was pitch black as we drove through the abandoned outskirts of New Orleans, and I said goodbye to my formal home, heading to this unknown place, Canada. It turns out everybody was right. Canada was a long ride. We stopped every few hours for a pee and to stretch our legs. Finally, about 3 a.m. on September 27th, we arrived at Buffalo International Airport, where we had to drop off the van. We had to drop off the van, I learned later, because the van was not allowed to leave the state. It was only the pleading of the woman with the crazy accent that had allowed us to get a van to come out of the state in the first place. But they certainly weren't willing for us to take a van outside of the United States. So there we were, 4 dogs, 2 human beings loaded into a station wagon. Eventually, within about half an hour, we arrived, and there was a bright sign that said, "Welcome to Canada." The man rolled down his window and was ready to be interrogated by the immigration officer about having 4 strange dogs, 2 in cages and 2 running around loose. When the man said, "These are Hurricane Katrina dogs," the immigration officer said, "Go ahead," without even taking a glance at our paperwork. At 5:30 in the morning, we arrived in front of a small side-split home in Burlington, Ontario. We unlocked the door, and to our amazement, the dogs were led right into the front door. I couldn't believe it. There, instantaneously, I met 2 new friends. Zach, a large shepherd mix, and Thunder, an older black lab retriever. They were warm and friendly and let us share their blankets and food bowls. We were amazed when the 2 people with the funny accents bent down and said, "These are your brothers, Zach and Thunder, and they love you." More moving to me was they looked down, hugged me, and said, "And we're your mommy and daddy." At about 8 a.m., a knock on the door occurred, and a woman came to pick up Beau. She had made arrangements to adopt him before we had even left Louisiana, and he jumped into her arms. She said she was going to name him Bayou, after the region where he was born. That was the last time I ever saw my traveling companion, Bayou. Over the months and years that came, I learned exactly what the human expression, "it's a dog's life," meant. I slept in a bed with my daddy. I went on walks every day. Most days I got to go to the woods and get all the smells and excitement of the Canadian North. I even experienced my first snow and learned to love running about in the snow. And yes, I will admit, I learned about drive-through windows, and I learned about eating ice cream cones. Me and my brothers even learned that for Mommy and Daddy's sake, we put on silly hats for our birthdays. I lived a life I could only have dreamed of. Mommy and Daddy said I lived the life I deserved. I never forgot the 21 days that I spent trapped in my attic after New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina almost killed me. But in the end, it saved my life. In many ways, my life began with Hurricane Katrina. To all of you here today, my name is Bart. I plead you, take the time, make the effort. In times of distress, lend a helping hand to those that need it, and we'll reward you with a lifetime of love and devotion. This is for Bart. Thank you.
Conditions with Hurricane Katrina. Right. And you mentioned that this particular dog that you rescued was from the lower Ninth Ward, which tends to be a poorer area of New Orleans. So were most of the dogs you rescued from poor areas? Like, assuming that people that lived in richer areas probably could afford to bring their dogs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a real economic aspect to Hurricane Katrina in terms of not only the human situation, which interests me from, because I study race within American history in my academic career. So there's really an element of that, you know, it really was about leaving poor black people behind. But poor black people don't have the capabilities of bringing their animals with them. Part of it was, you know, people didn't have cars. People didn't have, as I said, Louisiana is one of the worst places for animal rights in the United States. Dog fighting is incredibly prevalent down there. So motels don't accept dogs whatsoever, so that wasn't an option. So realistically, a lot of people, you know, there were, and I'm sure some of you saw some of those emotional scenes of people literally being forced to drop their dogs, saying, "We will leave you on this rooftop if you don't drop your dog." And people essentially having to choose between their own life and the life of their animal. And, you know, many people were just torn. And there were people that said, you know, raise the basket, I'm not leaving my dog, or I'm not leaving my cat. But, you know, the point of this and what we're trying to say and why we're still talking about Hurricane Katrina is, you know, still today, governments don't have animals included in their emergency response lessons. You know, I wish that I could say that if something happened like this, I would be confident that we wouldn't have these issues, but I don't have that confidence. I think the exact same thing happens. You know, we don't include animals in our preparedness programs. And, you know, as far as the socioeconomic thing, it's no different, right? Part of the problem is New Orleans is still suffering from a dog crisis. There are thousands of dogs, again, mostly pit bulls and Rottweilers because they're used for protection, that are in shelters or just wandering the streets, basically in, you know, units, because people down there don't have the financial resources to spay and neuter, and so as a result, this is perpetuated. I currently have a Louisiana rescue dog who is a year old. He was born in a shelter in New Orleans. He was a black lab mix, so he's not an aggressive dog, but he spent 11 months in a shelter. Nobody will adopt dogs in New Orleans. There's just so many dogs wandering around the streets of New Orleans. Nobody spays and neuters in lower income areas. And so the problem of Katrina, and that's part of why I wanted to say, and I thank Professor Sorensen and Liz for the opportunity to present this, is part of Katrina is still going on today. Just as it's going on for black people, it's still going on today for the dogs. There's, you know, after effects, grandchildren